Hi everybody, welcome. This is just a quick video on how to use AHEAD's interactive data dashboards. AHEAD, if you don't know already, is an NGO focused on creating inclusive environments in education and employment for people with disabilities in the Republic of Ireland. And I'd like to at this point take the opportunity to thank the Higher Education Authority who provide core funding for AHEAD's higher education activities, without which we wouldn't be able to produce these dashboards. I'd also like to thank InfoLab, who are the data visualization company who supported AHEAD pro bono as part of their charity work to actually support us in bringing this dashboard to life. So in terms of using the dashboard, just some things to note to put this dashboard into context. This is based on historical data that AHEAD has collected from disability and access services in higher education over a large number of years, originally beginning in 1993-94, initially happening periodically every number of years, and eventually now this data is collected on an annual basis. It should be noted that the data is only considering students registered for support, so students with disabilities who actually register for support with disability or access services in higher education. In other words, it does not count students who are undisclosed to those services. It should also be noted that some of the categories of disability change over time, have changed over time, and indeed you'll notice in some cases where earlier in our data set a category of disability does not exist or is at zero. That does not mean that there's no students with that category in the system. It just means that the category itself wasn't one of the categories that was monitored and data collected specifically on at that time. Equally, the fields of study have changed slightly over time. So the criteria for fields which is used is the International Standard Criteria for Education, the International Standard Classification for Education, should I say, and that's a European standard that's used now right around the world. So over time, some of those fields have very slightly altered in nature, and where that's happened, we've merged certain fields together to allow for useful comparison over time. Lastly, I'd just say that the dashboard itself is built on Tableau Public. It's very visual, and in some cases interactions with assistive technologies may not be appropriate with this dashboard. In other words, you may find difficulties if you're using assistive technology. Equally, these dashboards are best viewed on a laptop or tablet device, so I'd recommend that you use one of those types of devices to engage for the best experience. In terms of accessibility, if it's better for you to view the written data reports that these dashboards derive from, all of the reports are available from the AHEAD website, and there is a link on the page itself, and you can find all of this dashboard and the associated contents at ahead.ie/data center. So now let's take a look at the dashboard and we'll just get some tips up on how best to functionally use it. So you can see from my screen here that this is ahead.ie/data center, the main interactive data center dashboard page. There's just some notes at the top about how to use that, but I'm going to skip on down to the dashboard itself for now. So what we first encounter is the selection of the year. So you'll notice here that some of the charts that are displayed are actually displaying information over time. So you can see here, for example, that this chart is displaying information from 1993-94 right up to 1920, whereas others are more giving a snapshot of an individual here. You can see on the left that we have a breakdown of students with disabilities registered with the support services by primary disability, and on the right hand side we have the percentage of students in those categories that are receiving exam accommodation. So these ones are actually snapshots in individual years. So how do we know what we're looking at? Well, what we look at is at the top here, when we select a year, that's going to change the data for any of the snapshot dashboard sections. So in other words, if I select here 2015-16, it's going to update now. Firstly, it's going to highlight in the actual over time charts, it's going to put a specific highlight on the year that we're examining so you can see it more easily. And further down in the snapshot sections, the actual information here is going to change accordingly based on the snapshot of year. So what you're now looking at is the breakdown of students with disabilities registered with services in the year 15-16, and that goes right through the dashboard itself. So any of those things that are snapshot years, such as the fields of study, for example, that's going to be the snapshot of the fields of study in the selected year at the top. So just pay heed to that as you go down, and you can move between those years anytime you want as you use the dashboard. What you're seeing at the very top here, I'm going to go back to 1920 for the moment. And what you can see at the very top here is that we encounter our very first two dashboards. Our very first two dashboards are looking at the total students registered with support services by number over time, and indeed those receiving exam accommodations over time. So the number of students who actually receive one or more exam accommodations as part of their higher education. And those dashboards, you can actually get the overall total, as you can see there, and it's giving you the year-on-year rise in numbers on those. And you can also actually hover in to get a tooltip which will give you more information on a specific year. So although we have 1920 selected, if you want to quickly check one of the other years, you can actually just hover in over and get a tooltip which is showing you more detailed information. You can see here 2017-18 is showing 11,746 students registered for exam accommodations in that year with a disability. Equally, you can do that on the total numbers registered with support services on the left hand side. So you can see here, for example, that in 11-12 there was 7,957 students registered with HE disability support services. Further down, if we come into our percentage breakdown of disability, so what this second table that we're looking at here is actually measuring what percentage of the student population is registered with disability support services. And you can see here that we have a breakdown at undergraduate level from the total number, was the undergraduate level is there in blue, the total number there in grey, so that's the total student population, and in green then below the postgraduate population. So we can see that currently in the selected year, which is 1920, it shows that 7.2% of the undergraduate population are registered with support services, 6.3% of the total population, but only 2.5% of the postgraduate population. And you can see very clearly over time that this graph is showing us that the undergraduate total populations have grown at a much greater rate than the postgraduate population. So even though over time the postgraduate population itself has grown, it just hasn't grown at the same rate. And the interesting thing is that we can also hover over this graph to find a tooltip for any specific year to get more information. For example, if I want to see how many postgraduates were there in 2015-16, I can just hover over the point at 2015-16 and it's going to tell me very precisely that there was 1,031 postgraduates with disabilities registered with services, and at that time that was 2.6% of the postgraduate population. So really useful information and a really good tool to interrogate the data over time very quickly. Moving down to our look at the snapshots of the individual selected year, which of course is 1920 at the moment, but you could pick any specific year if you have a very specific query about something. And you can see here that on the left hand side we have the breakdown by primary disability, and you can see here that specific learning difficulty in that year is by far the most common breakdown. So this is telling you that 36.9% of the student population registered with disability support services in that year had specific learning difficulty as their primary disability. The really cool thing is that you can actually hover over these and get the sort of track over time of where these students are at. So if I hover over there, I can actually see how that percentage has changed over time. So you can see back in 2005-06 when we started to do this type of breakdown of information, it was actually 56.1% of the disabled student population were registered as having specific learning difficulty as their primary disability. So after an initial rise then heading into 2009-10 and 10-11, that starts to kind of go in a downward direction. And even though the numbers of students with a specific learning difficulty haven't changed drastically, have actually risen over time, it's just that the other categories of disability have actually caught up. So there's really interesting information and insights to be had there. Equally, what we can see is that the percentage of students registered for exam accommodations by primary disability, we can do exactly the same thing with that. So if we hover over, we can see the different percentages over time. So as I hover over specific learning difficulty here, what I'm getting is the percentage of those with a specific learning difficulty who actually received exam accommodations over time. So you can see here that in 11-12 that 81% of students with a specific learning difficulty would have received one or more exam accommodations, but that's actually risen over time up until 93% in 2019-20. So again, you can get very, very specific data with really a lot of information. And you might be thinking here as you hover over these, God, I really wish I could get the number for any of these years. Well, you actually can by changing the year at the top. So at the moment, this main tooltip at the top here is telling us for 1920, but if I go back up and I select 2018-19, that's going to update the tooltip that I see here, and you can see at the top now it's giving me the actual figure for 2018-19 as well as the standard graph over time that it did before. So moving down to our next piece, we're going to look at the fields of study breakdown, which is really, really interesting. And the way this particular chart defaults to is looking at the breakdown of fields of study of students with disabilities registered with support services, which is in blue, and then you have these small green lines which denote where the general student population is at for that particular field. So what percentage of the general student population studies in the same field. So you get these really clear indicators of where there's quite significant differences between students with disabilities and the general student population. So you can see here, for example, that if I hover over to get the tooltip, that you can see here that students with disabilities in 2018-19, that there was 3,508 students with disabilities registered in arts and humanities, and that represented 22.3% of the disabled student population enrolled in one of those programs, whereas only 14.1% of the general student population was enrolled in those programs. And because I've hovered over arts and humanities, it's giving me that breakdown between the general and the disabled student population over time and how those trends have changed. So you can really begin to see how students are making different options over time and how that, how their fields of study choices have been affected. Equally then, if you want to hone down and have a look at one specific disability type and see where they are at in relation to the other, the other categories, the general disability category, or indeed the total student population, you can do that by actually selecting one from this breakdown here. So if I do that, I'm going to select, for example, Asperger's autism, because I always find the fields of study here really, really interesting to note in terms of the quite significant differences in some area. So I select that. What I have is my dashboard updates. Remember that it's still updating, it's still considering this piece at the top, so it's still in relation to 2018-19 right now that we're seeing the kind of main tooltip data. But you can see here now, if I hover over arts and humanities, that it's giving me three figures. So it's giving me the Asperger's autism figure, which is represented in by the grey bar here, but it's also giving me the general student population in green and the disabled student population in blue. So that tells me that actually students in the Asperger's autism category are more likely to study in the arts and humanities field than those in the other groups, quite significantly actually. And you can see over time in the tooltip now how that relationship has changed between 2011-12 when we first started collecting that fields of study data right up until the present day. So it's really detailed information, and it enables you to get very specific with what you want from the data. So just removing this and setting this back to none for a moment. The final table is a little confusing to look at initially, but this is a very quick way of examining the breakdown of students with disabilities over time, and just using tooltips to actually kind of interrogate it in a very quick way. So for example, if I want to, I can see here that pink is dyspraxia, DCD dyspraxia. If I hover over a tooltip, I can very quickly move along and get the general numbers registered with dyspraxia over time just by hovering over these tooltips and making sure that I get the piece that I want. So if I want 2016-17, for example, I've seen it there. That's 773 students, and it's also 6% of the disabled student population. In other words, 6% of those registered with services highlight DCD dyspraxia as their primary disability. So that's a little bit about our data dashboards. I hope you have some fun engaging with them and interrogating them, and I hope this video has been useful. Thank you very much for taking the time to explore.